best practices for Smart eCat. Really what we want to take a look at is some of the nuances or some of the subtleties that exist inside of the Smart eCat module that we haven't potentially looked at or talked about. We've talked about in other webinars tasks like adding a smart job or building a ticket using Smart eCat. We're going to kind of skirt around some of those topics with some of today's introduction, but we really want to look at a few different features or a few different pieces as far as Smart eCat is concerned as it comes to actually using it not only at point of sale but in its catalog application. Before we get too deep into that, there's a couple of things I want to start out with. First is we're going to look at Smart eCat from the perspective of using both smart jobs, category searches, as well as using what I call just the search functionality inside of Smart eCat. Before we, again, as we begin, I want to start out with a transaction. In this case, I've got Allison Swanson, who has brought in her 2001 Dodge Durango to have some work done today. We're going to look at the service requests, or we look at the parts and labor tab. The first thing we're going to start out with, we're going to start out talking about oil changes and or really maintenance items inside of Smart eCat. So in this case, we're going to add an oil change onto our transaction. We're going to use Smart eJobs in the upper left-hand corner. And again, we've got Smart eCat and we have Smart eJobs, two different entry points into the exact same catalog resource. We'll get back to that before the end of this morning's conversation. But I'll click on Smart eJobs, and in my case, I have built smart jobs for my maintenance items, specifically in this case, an oil change. And as I go down and look at my category listing, I've got my oil change dash standard category, and when I look at the list of available items in here, we've got, starting at the top, the oil viscosity, the engine oil type, and our 5W20 full service oil change. When it comes to oil changes and really specifications in general and using them inside of Smart eCat, we're going to look at the three different items that we're going to potentially look for as part of an oil change. In this case, the first one says oil viscosity, the second one says engine oil type, and the third one down, or the third options down would be beginning my different viscosities of oil. We're going to look for our engine oil capacity as part of looking for that particular, adding that particular job. If I was going to go ahead and do this oil change for Allison Swanson, I could select my viscosity and or my oil change, which again is going to look at my engine oil capacity as well as add the oil and the oil filter. Again, not a real dramatic difference to what we've done previously, but if I go through and I just add this job onto the ticket, when I click on go, it gives me my engine oil capacity, in this case 6 quarts of oil for that 2001 Dodge Durango. I'm going to add or make that note on my transaction so my technicians are aware. I put a check mark in the box on the right-hand side, hit next in the upper right-hand corner, continue on to selecting my oil filter, where I do have these in stock, so I'll grab the one that's on my shelf, hit next again in the upper right-hand corner, and I'll get to my posted parts and labor tab. I've got my package price of $32.99 that's established on that oil change. I'm going to drop this job back on the ticket. I'll hit post and exit. I drop it onto the ticket, and again, what's another, smart jobs do not adjust the capacity, meaning 5 quarts is what's included in my base oil change, which is what gets incorporated into that $32.99 package. Now from here, I want to make sure that I'm charging for that additional quart, in this case 6 quarts of oil versus 5, and there's really 2 ways that we can go about doing that. So we talk about some of the best practices from Smart eCat perspective. If I go back and look at my Smart eJobs window, and we were in the category of oil change dash standard, what I've got down here towards the bottom is I have additional oil. So down here, mirroring each of the viscosities that we've got configured up towards the top, I've got my additional 520, 530, or 1030 oil, and in this case, I need to add on 1 additional quart. So I'll grab my additional 530 oil, I'll click on go, and as we get into this window here, there's my additional oil. If it was more than 1, there's my quantity right there. I could either change it here, and or if I clicked on post and exit, then it'll drop that additional job onto the transaction. And again, were I needing to change the quantity, simply opening up that part, and towards the upper left-hand corner, I can change the quantity that we're including as part of this 5W30 oil. I'm going to take this off of here for just a second because I said there were really a couple of different ways that we could accomplish that additional oil. The way we don't want to do it, and again, when I say a couple, that the one was adding the additional line, would be to just simply come in here and change my quantity from 5 to 6. I change that quantity from 5 to 6. It understands that now the extended price for 6 quarts higher than the extended for 5. When I click on OK, what you'll notice is my package price does not change. The package pricing in RWriter is very good at what it does, and I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, because if I was to open up the labor job, look down here in the lower right-hand corner, this is a package price at $32.99. So if I wanted to have the system adjust it, I would need to tell it that this was no longer a package. One other point to make as we're looking at these here, you'll notice all of my options in this window are grayed out. They were also grayed out as we were looking at the part as well. I had minimal opportunity to change information such as the supplier, the cost, or the sell on a particular item. With version 1.30, we introduced a feature called price locking, and it works for either package jobs and or parts in inventory, where you can tell the system that there is a specific price established for this, and the only way that I could modify away from that would be if I was to override the lock on this particular repair order. So if I went back to my comment about, well, there's a couple of different ways to do this, I'm going to first change my oil from 6 quarts back to 5. There's that similar override button, but in this case, we don't want to override my cost or my sell. $2.09 per quart sell to the consumer is the price we'll use for this particular oil change. As we're coming back in here, if I wanted to change that just by changing the quantity of the oil, the first thing I would need to do is I would need to tell the system, well, this is no longer a package at $32.99. So I'm going to override that by putting in my security level. I'm going to tell it that it's no longer a package. We're just going to charge $17 in labor. And once I charge my $17 in labor, when I then adjust my quantity of oil, going from 5 to 6, and then click on OK, you'll notice it then increments the dollar amount by that $2.09. When I removed the package, it changed it to $32.94 as opposed to $32.99, simply because that was the sum total of the components as they existed at that time. So not an exact science in terms of what we do when we remove the package, hence why adding that additional job for that additional weight of oil is the most effective means to make sure that we're charging the full boat for the oil change with the 5 quarts and then additional oil on top. We'll look at a different example as far as oil changes are concerned. I'm going to pick on Mr. Elon Moody down here at the bottom, who has a 2008 Cadillac XLR that he's brought in, again, for an oil change today. We've added our courtesy check onto the transaction, and I'm going to want to go through and I'm going to want to do that exact same oil change. So in this case, we're going to go through, and if I came just down to my oil change dash standard category, then went down to my 5W30 full service oil change, I could begin down the path of adding this oil change onto the transaction. When I click on Go, it tells me that the capacity on that Cadillac XLR is going to be 8 quarts of oil. So again, going back to my previous scenario, we'll want to add 3 quarts of oil. However, those of you that are familiar, you're probably already trying to get me to go back because standard oil for a 2008 Cadillac XLR is probably not the right choice. As I go back and look at my smart shop, I'm going to close out of here just so that it doesn't remember we had already begun going through the process of a smart job. As I build my jobs, if I look down in my job category, I've got my oil change dash standard, and in here, the very first one says oil viscosity. So is it 520, 530, 1030? So if I was to select that, you'll notice the only purpose that this job has to exist is to allow us to check that viscosity. And when I click on Go, it tells me that the recommended viscosity for an 08 Cadillac XLR is 5W30. Well, great. That was the job we had just started to add just a moment ago, so I'm not sure why we want to maybe leave and or remove that. Well, the answer is in this second job that I've got. Underneath oil viscosity, down here it says engine oil type. For those of you that have used smart jobs and or smart eCat for some time, Epicor recently added this engine oil sometime mid to late 2015, so third or fourth quarter of last year, where it will now help us to find if it's a weight of oil that is other than just a standard weight. So when I select engine oil and click on Go, what we now see is it tells us that the recommendation is to use synthetic oil that matches at least the original equipment, which was this GM standard. And so it's telling us that this should be a full synthetic oil change, not just a standard. It does also recommend we use oil certified by the American Petroleum Institute. That's going to be a fairly standard recommendation regardless of what vehicle we're working from. So if I was to go back through and follow this scenario, we checked our viscosity of 530, we checked our oil type, now which tells me synthetic, so now I want to go back and look at my Smart Job tab where I'll switch from my category of just standard weights of oil to, in my case, I carry full synthetic in Mobile 1, and from there I'll grab my 5W30 full synthetic Mobile 1 oil change. Now this still does include just up to 5 quarts of full synthetic oil. So as I add this, I click on Go and it tells me, well, 8 quarts is what goes in that Cadillac XLR. We'll click on Next to have it find the filter. Even though it's 8 quarts of synthetic, it's still a standard priced filter in my case. Click on Next, and then I want to add on 3 additional quarts of oil. So I'll click on Post and immediately come back here and say, let's go down to my additional 5W30 Mobile 1 synthetic. Click on Go. Pardon me. By default, that adds just a single quantity. I can either change it here, and if I was to change it here, I simply clear the value that's there, make my change, and if you'll notice my cursor is still flashing in that window, I have to click on any other box in this line, and now it remembers the change, and when I click Post and Exit, across to my ticket I get my Mobile 1 synthetic as well as my additional 530 Mobile 1, my quantity adjusted to 3. Had I added it to at 1, I could simply come in here and I could make my modification to my quantity. So either way would work, whether we change it as we're in Smart eCat or whether we change it as we're coming back over to the ticket. But again, we're grabbing that additional job to make sure we're reflecting those additional 3 quarts of full synthetic oil. If I was to go back to Allison for the 2001 Dodge Durango we first started with, what you'd notice is if I went through and I did the similar steps, so let's check the oil viscosity, let's check the engine oil type, we can do that on that vehicle as well. So we'll stick with our standard check the viscosity, which tells us that for that 2001 Dodge Durango 530, as long as we're primarily driving below 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and then back to our Smart Job listing where it says engine oil type, we'll click on Go, and then now I can see that in this case, it's not recommending synthetic, it's just recommending oil certified by the American Petroleum Institute. So in this case, that standard 530 oil applicable and going into that 2001 Dodge Durango. I'm going to leave our oil changes here for just a moment and go back over to my Smart eJob tab. So we've got Smart Jobs inside of the system, and if you're interested in knowing more about, well, how do we build those, we have not only a recorded webinar that you can access that talks to that, but also in the upcoming weeks, we've got a webinar specifically relative to building and managing Smart Jobs inside of the system. So we're not going to spend a whole bunch of time on that topic today, but really when we talk about best practices as it comes to any maintenance type service that's going to have a specific capacity and will charge as we exceed that capacity, it doesn't matter whether it's trans fluid or coolant or diesel oil or in this case synthetic or standard oil, we have that additional way to get outside of the package and charge for those additional fluids on top of what we're working from. I'm going to change my job category. I'm going to drop this down, and I'm going to go to the category of cooling and heating. Again, just one more kind of look at Smart Jobs, as it were. As I drop this down, under cooling and heating, you'll notice I have what's called a water pump remove and replace and a water pump complete job remove and replace. Now, as we look at Smart Jobs, again, Smart Jobs are essentially just a list of tasks for the catalog and or for our writer to perform as we're working our way through the catalog. In my case, if we looked at the water pump remove and replace job, it's very specific, meaning its only 2 tasks are to go find the book time labor to replace the water pump as well as to find the part from our catalog. We can go through that exercise. We'll click on Go. And again, starting with the part, we'll find the water pump. And then if we hit Next in the upper right-hand corner, once we answer a vehicle-specific condition, we'll find that our water pump time is 0.2 of an hour. If it has power steering, then we should add, 2 hours. If it has power steering, that adds an additional 0.2 of an hour, which in this case that 01 Dodge Durango does. We'll drop that onto the ticket, and we'll hit post and exit. So it drops that job onto the ticket. So again, as we look at it, just using the catalog to find both parts and labor. Now, slightly differently, if I looked at my cooling and heating category, I also got one that's called the water pump complete job remove and replace. And this one gets a little bit more detailed. Meaning, if we're going to do the water pump, the way that I've configured my job, I also want to make sure that we're considering the radiator hose and the thermostat. So in this first section where it says catalog part, it says, well, we may or may not need each of these elements each time we're going to do a water pump. So let's make sure that we've addressed or considered those as we go through. Same with the labor. We're looking for the labor for the water pump, but if we're replacing the thermostat, well, then I'd like to look for that labor individually as well. And again, I can include as many of these as I'd like as I look through this list. When I'm looking at the parts, I'm going to want to make sure I charge for some hose clamps. So along with that, I'm going to have to put those hoses back on and likely replace the hose clamps, especially if we're going to replace the radiator hose. And then we've got our cooling system fluid exchange, which once we put the new water pump, as well as maybe the thermostat and some hoses, I need to put some coolant back in there. So let's make sure that we're charging to not only take the old coolant out, but also put new coolant in as we complete the service. These boxes on the left-hand side, as we look through them, you've got just empty boxes. And I will tell you that the natural inclination when you see boxes somewhere is that if you'd like them to do something, you actually go ahead and check those boxes. These are slightly different. If you notice, there's a legend down here at the bottom. It says not viewed, items posted, and or excluded. So as we begin a job, each of the different aspects of it are flagged as having not been viewed, meaning we haven't started and gotten to the point of the job where it's considered and or shown us that element. Now, if we want, as we begin, to exclude certain items, then all we'll do is we'll just click on the box and it'll change it from that white box to a red X. Notice it says we're going to now exclude that from this particular search. So starting with that at the excluded item, we'll click on Go. And as we click on Go in the in the lower section of our window, it starts us down the path of going at and looking at the different items. If we looked at the first one there, it says that we're going to look for that water pump that's part of this component and or service. If I immediately jumped back to my Smart eJob tab, what you'll notice is we haven't yet done anything. It's still just that box. As soon as I click on Next, and in this case, I'm purposely not selecting anything from this window, I'll click on Next, and it takes me into my next item, which in this case is my thermostat, which it wants to know before it can search whether it's four-wheel or all-wheel drive. I went back and looked at my Smart eJob tab again. What you'll notice is my legend's now changed from the box to the circle because I was in that window. I viewed it. However, I did not actually post any items as we went through. So when I looked at my catalog search, I then now checked a box and hit Next in the upper right-hand corner. Takes me to the next item on my list, where as I look back on my Smart eJob tab, it's now as a checkbox in that thermostat because we were at that window and we have posted some items. Well, I forgot to post the water pump. I'd like to go back and look at that again. If I simply click on that box there, it changes it back to the open box. And when I click on Go, and it says, well, the very first listed item where it's just that empty box is where I'm going to go. I could now come back, I could select that water pump and click on Next. So again, once I clicked on Next, it skipped the radiator hose. We told it to exclude that item. It also skipped the thermostat. We have been at that window and selected something previously, so we don't need to pick something as we go through. So now we're just at our labor window. And again, we can always navigate back and forth, just two separate tabs. Here's the job we're working from, and here is the specific element of that job that we are currently involved in. To the upper right-hand corner, you have Back, Post, and Next. We're constantly using the Next button. We've used it as we've gone through this morning's conversation to go from the oil to the filter and then to what we call our posted parts and labor tab. In this case, we also have the Back button, which says, well, here are the two windows that you've been at previously, and that checkbox on the left-hand side indicates that we were at that window and we had selected something. Were I to click Next, Takes me to my next window for the thermostat, where now if I looked at the back, it'd say, well, you know what, we were at the water pump window, we were at the thermostat window, both of those, we selected something as we went through. If we were to go back to the catalog labor window, again, that empty circle tells me that we hadn't yet selected something. The back and next buttons behave a little bit odd, and I mean that just by the fact that once you understand what they do, much easier to use them effectively as you navigate through the catalog. And that is, if I were to go back, so let's go all the way back to the very first item, that water pump, and I'd like to look at additional items. When I click on Next in the upper right-hand corner, I can either say I'd like to go to this specific function, or if I just click on Next, it takes me again, because I've been at each one of those windows, it says, well, the only window we haven't yet touched is now our posted parts and labor tab. So again, I went back and looked at the catalog. If I really wanted to go to a window where we have already been, then I'd have to go ahead and I'd have to tell the system that I wanted to stop at the labor for the water pump. Again, when I click on Next, it says, then you know what, the next item that we were looking at that was unchecked is going to be the catalog labor for the thermostat. And then last but not least, if I look at my posted parts and labor tab, then we could now have the different items that we selected as we went through our search. I'm going to exit out of here and not take anything back over because I want to come back out and do the exact same job just again. I don't want to necessarily confuse the one that we've already been working from. But so as you look at the legend, and I'm going to go back down to cooling and heating, and then as I get down into my water pump complete job, the legend on the left-hand side, not only for informational purposes, but as we go through and do multiple searches or go back and forth within an individual category, we can go ahead and we can bring those over. So as we continue on through this here, another piece that I wanted to talk about before we get out of smart jobs and look at a couple of other facets here is, and this is not necessarily specific to a smart job, but we often get the question of, well, I'd like to be able to see multiple different items on the screen at the same time. I will tell you that it is specifically designed to not allow for that behavior. The part suppliers, as we talk to them about what we do inside of eCat, want us to make sure that there is the need for the end user to make a conscious decision to look at one vendor versus the other. So when I look at my water pump here, if I check that box and I say, well, let me compare the part itself, let me compare the line, let me compare the manufacturer and or the pricing, if I was to hit the plus key to the left of O'Reilly, what you'll notice is it minimizes Napa. However, there's no reason I couldn't grab both of those, click on Next, and in my case, we're going to skip back we're going to skip going through the rest of the different job items, but you'll notice on my posted parts and labor tab, I can have more than one part from one vendor. However, I've made that conscious decision to select both of them as we've gone through. So if you're looking to have on the same screen at the same time a part from an individual vendor, as we go through looking for the part, we do need to make sure that we're selecting that. In this case, we'll grab, in this case, we've got some radiator hoses. We'll grab from two different vendors, and again, when I click on Next, it drops them into our posted parts and labor tab, and again, the more parts that I include, the more that I'll see. The more real estate I have available, the more parts that I can see at any given point in time. I wanted to remove something from this window, not inherently obvious how I would do that, but I've decided that we're going to order the one from O'Reilly. All I'll do is I'll left-click on the gray box on the far left-hand side of that line, and then hit the delete key on my keyboard. Once I do, it says, you have selected one row for deletion. Choose yes to delete the row or no to exit. When I answer yes, then that goes away. In this case, Napa is still listed as a supplier that was considered. However, because they have no parts, once we post an exit or continue through our catalog search, I'm not going to come back and want to associate anything with our friends from Napa. So as we go through, and again, that functionality is true whether we're utilizing a smart job and or whether we're using a category search and or just the search functionality inside of our writer. And to close back out of there, a couple last things that I wanted to talk about as part of my best practices or tips and tricks as it relates to smart eCat. As we come back up here, everything that we've searched for to this point, we've used a smart job, and certainly, that works well in certain scenarios, however, not in every scenario. Up here at the top, there's either the search button and or the category window. As I launched into Smart eCat through this Smart eJobs icon, it takes me out to this Smart eJob tab. I often get the question of, well, what's the right way to go out to the catalog? And in this case, I'm going to click on Smart eCat in the upper left-hand corner. The only difference between the two is when I click on the icon in the upper left-hand corner, it takes me to what's called a category search. You'll notice we're on our catalog tab. If I click Smart eJobs here in the upper left-hand corner and then simply click category, you'll notice we end up in the exact same place. So they are just two different entry points into the same catalog inside of our writer. When I get asked, well, why does the one in the upper left-hand corner even exist? My answer would be, well, if we're just looking for a part, so I don't necessarily have a transaction or I don't want to open an estimate or a work in progress ticket, I can still use Smart eCat independent of an estimate and or a work in progress ticket. So if I wanted to enter in my year, my make, my model, and my engine, and then go and search, in this case, let's just see what we've got in filters, engine, and transmission, we can do that. So we can go through and we can search, we can find the parts that would fit, as well as find out who has them available. In this case, I've got two of that filter on my shelf, $10.99 selling price to the consumer. The difference is when I start through Smart eCat and I am not in an estimate and or a transaction, in this case, when we get to our posted parts and labor tab, what you'll notice is my only option is to click exit. I can't post or post and exit because I didn't start from inside of a transaction. So the difference really is when we start through the icon here, we have tied it to a transaction, or if we hit Smart eCat while an estimate was open, we'll tie it to that transaction, bring across your make, model, engine, and have the ability to post back to that transaction. If I don't have an estimate or a work in progress ticket, I can still use the catalog, but we don't have that repository to pass information back to. We're not saving whatever information we found as we were out navigating through Smart eCat. A couple last things as far as that's concerned. I'm going to come back in here into my Smart eCat window. At the top, there's either the search function and or there's the category function inside of the program. And these are used frequently by any shop that uses Smart eCat extensively. And I want everybody to get the idea that I think Smart Jobs works for every scenario inside of the program. There are a couple hundred Smart Jobs in my listing there. There are thousands of items that will replace over the course of time. So for example, if we were going to go ahead and look up some additional items, how about if we were going to go ahead and replace the power steering pressure switch on this vehicle? If I go ahead and use the search functionality, what the search functionality does is it takes us into a specific part description or labor description. Important to note the difference, because if I said, well, let's look up the power steering pressure switch, I'll start out on the labor side. I will double click on that job, or on that that part description, and in this case, got one available at my local Napa. I'll check the box, and then from here, before I go up and click find to do my next search, I either have to hit post or next, one or the other. No difference at this point. If I hit post, that says add that item to our posted parts and labor tab. Let me just go back up and click on find. If I click next, it says add that item to our posted parts and labor tab and take us to that tab so I can review what's been done. So again, I do need to tell the system that I want to post that before I click on find, come back out here and say, let's go ahead and let's add on that next power steering pressure switch, or in this case on the right-hand side, searching for the labor. I'll check that box and I'll hit post because I've got additional items I want to search for. How about a battery? And I'll go ahead and I'll just put in my keyword battery. Or on the left-hand side with the parts, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab the battery. Got one available, whether it's in my local stock and or coming from my local vendor, but we'll grab the one I've got on my shelf. I'm going to hit post and then come and find the labor. In this case, 0.5 of an hour to remove, replace, and test the battery and post that in as well. We can continue down that path. So if I said, let's go ahead and let's look for a starter. And again, we're going to go ahead and just find, in this case, 3 different types of parts. I'll go ahead and I'll grab it. Want to know, is it the N engine code? We'll see if it makes a difference as we answer our question. But in this case, we're going to grab that new starter, click on post to drop it into my posted parts and labor tab, and click on find because I want to find the labor to remove and replace the starter as well. We've finished grabbing the different elements as part of our searching here. As we get back to our window, I've got a battery in stock. I've got my parts, which are coming from Napa, the pressure switch, as well as the starter. If I looked at my labor tab, we're in a room to replace the pressure switch, 6/10, 5/10, and 8/10. If I just clicked on Post and Exit, by default, it would add a new job onto the ticket in the category of steering and suspension, and steering and suspension labor would be the description associated with it. And that's because the very first item that we started out our search with was part of my steering and suspension category, or at least it was mapped to that. I really have 3 different jobs that I'd like to add that incorporate 3 different types of parts. So down here at the bottom, I'm going to tell it not to post the parts and labor to an existing job, but I'd like to add the individual parts and labor to the invoice. At the same time, I'd like to replace the predefined description. So here where it says labor options, it says, well, we're going to add now 3 separate jobs. That's the number I've got, 1, 2, and 3. We're going to add 3 separate jobs, and I don't want to use steering and suspension labor as my description. I would like to use the description that was associated with it in the Epicor catalog. So power steering pressure, battery, and then starter assembly. When I now click Post/Exit, take us back over to our transaction for Allison, where there are 3 separate labor jobs, the power steering switch, the battery, the starter assembly, each coming across with their individual labor times, and then 3 separate parts. And all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to drag and drop to make sure I'm associating the parts with the appropriate job. So drag up, drop as it's on power steering, drag up, drop as it's on battery, and drag up and drop as it's on starter. So I spent my time in the catalog searching for all of the different parts that I needed, all the different labor times that I needed, without having to exit the catalog and go back in. I simply found all of the parts, added them individually, and then now went back and associated the parts with the labor. So we can use the catalog not just for a single search, but as extensively as we'd like within one individual transaction. One last piece before we finish up this morning, and that's as it relates to the category search. Category search is excellent if you're looking for multiple different facets of a specific type. For example, when I did my search for starter, all it showed me was the starter. If I look down here, I've got a starter replacement category, which when I look for it, it'll give me the combined and or the sum total of the starter, the solenoid, the relay, and the switch. So I'm looking for more than just a specific part type. The category search is a very good way to find related parts together. You notice when I do a category search, here's my category, here's my parts, and here is my labor. If I wanted to select a starter, well, let's go ahead and grab that starter. Before I switched from parts to labor, that's again where I click Post. Now I can come back and I could say, well, find me the labor. And again, because we did the category search, not just the time to remove and replace the starter assembly, but the drive, the relay, and the solenoid individually. So again, a more extensive list, not necessarily as filtered down to a singular part description. But I could come in here and I could say, well, let's grab the time, let's post it, and then now let's switch my category from one to another. So now in this case, I switched to exhaust. Let's look at the exhaust parts, and now it does my search again. So again, we can navigate through the category window. I specifically came to exhaust because there is one unique nuance to exhaust that doesn't exist anywhere else inside of the program. If you've used SmartyCat, you've probably seen the N's, the C's, the I's, the icons over here on the left-hand side. It'll take us out to, in this case, it's an image from Napa's ProLink site and show us a bit more information about that particular part. You'll also see, as you look at exhaust, this icon here that says D with a catalog diagram number. In this case, 2 different nuances, one versus the other. Actually, I'm sorry, same exact catalog diagram number. Under Walker, that tells you that here is their catalog diagram. And if I was going to look at the exhaust system on a 2001 Dodge Durango, then here's the converter number, there's the hanger clamp gasket that it's looking for, and so on and so forth. So it's a 2.5 inch, 2.25 inch clamp that it's looking as we go through. So you can see exhaust diagrams as well. Anytime you see that yellow line that says catalog diagram number, that D out on the left-hand side is going to be your link to the exhaust diagram. And it's not unique to just a specific vendor or manufacturer. In this case, Walker also through Advanced. If I was to look down through the list, they also have Dynamax. And again, there's my catalog diagram showing the parts that were I to use Dynamax as my supplier. where I'd find those. One last caveat as far as that's concerned, and that is, unlike these I's, the C's, the N's that we see that reach out to the web to find that information, that catalog diagram for exhaust is resident local on your computer, meaning when they send out those DVDs on a monthly basis, they actually include those catalog diagrams, and as we load the catalog, it's going to bring that information up. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open up what's called my Parts Expert Data Utility. So hang with me just a second while I get to that particular function, but I'll be back with you in just a moment. Because once we get in and look at our Parts Expert Data Utility, when that window opens, there's this checkbox here that says Extract Graphics File. Again, if you're using SmartyCat, which relies on the Epicor catalog, this is how we're loading those DVDs on a month-to-month basis. That checkbox there that says Extract Graphics File is what tells the system to copy the exhaust diagrams from the disks over to your local hard drive. That is the only thing that it impacts, is those exhaust diagrams. If they're not a concern, or you don't really think that it'll ever use that, then you can uncheck the box. It will not copy those over. It will minimize, or it will reduce the amount of time it takes to load disk 2 by a factor of probably somewhere there about 5 minutes or so, depending on the speed of your DVD drive and your computer in general. But if you want those exhaust diagrams available, we do have to extract the graphics file. My advice is, if you do that, or if you want them, check it each time. If you forget to check it once, it doesn't erase them. It will not remove them from your system. However, it will not add any newer diagrams that are available. Even on older model vehicles, as either as exhaust products change and or new lines get either added in or removed, they will update those diagrams. So again, to make sure you've got the most recent set, check the box. It will copy those across as it does the update.